on the blacktop with the girls because the fields always had traditionally belonged to the boys and the blacktop to the girls. She was in the first generation to play recreational soccer. The recreational soccer program was only for boys. The first girl to ride her bike to school, there was a rule that only boys got, don't ask me why. Only boy, I guess boys are safer.
We could get into a big discussion about women and bicycles.
Bicycles, okay. She was the first group, among the first group of girls who were allowed to wear pants to school, because in those days, girls had to wear skirts or dresses. And what they did was they wore shorts underneath because they were very inhibited about going up on the equipment because someone would see their panties. So they had to wear these skirts, but they wore the shorts. She was in the first group who could take books out of the school library that had girls as a central character, or that had biographies of accomplished women. There were almost none before 1967 to 1970. And she was in one of the first generations to be able to go to an Ivy League college, because at the Ivy League university that she went to was still all male through her childhood. So these are the kinds of things that people would find amazing, and we're only talking about 40 years ago. Now I'm wondering, was there anything in your elementary, preschool, kindergarten, or elementary years that you felt was unfair? And did it seem to be related to gender?
Actually, I wasn't conscious of it then, so I even look back because I wrote a memoir, and I didn't begin to think about gender at all until I was 17, at all. So I don't know why I didn't. All I know is that I just was very rebellious, but I didn't associate it with gender. My mother always told me that I was named after Barbara Fritchie, and I looked her up, and I said, wow. And then she said she was thinking of naming me after Lucretia Mott, which I'm very glad I wasn't.
Wow, your mother was really
But I really looked up Lucretia Mott. But to be quite honest, it really wasn't until I became a teenager and involved in the civil rights movement, and then, of course, got involved in the women's movement. But it wasn't until I was involved in the civil rights movement that I began to think in terms of women and gender.
So, really, you had a rebellious kind of personality, but it wasn't focused until the civil rights movement.
Right.
The movement for race equity started you thinking of, was there anything in the civil rights movement that made you feel as though women were not being treated as the same as men?
Well, I was a very young girl, and I was not politically conscious. What I was aware of was just being overwhelmed, and as a young woman, and I think being a young woman, I felt more overwhelmed because there were a lot of things I didn't feel I could do for issues of safety. Now, I wasn't allowed to go down south because I wasn't old enough, but even in New York, when I would picket or sit in or something like that, there were issues of safety for the girls, as we were called. But no, I don't. The consciousness wasn't there, gender at all. And remember, it wasn't in the vocabulary.
It wasn't.
It was not in the vocabulary. Even when, and as a historian I know this, but even when the Equal Pay Act got passed, and when in the Great Society and Johnson started passing legislation that would grant levels of equity for women, everybody who was going to be the head of the Equal Opportunity Commission promised that they wouldn't do anything about challenging gender roles.
Yes.
So it's really not until the late 60s that shall we say, the feminist explosion begins. And then people begin to think of the world totally differently.
Yeah, I think that's what people really have a hard time. Like they look at us and our child, and they say, "Well, why didn't you rebel against that?" It was the natural order of things.
Or so it appeared. Like, yes.
These were things you didn't question.
Right.
And so we lived that way until something clicked with us.
And remember, the 50s is the period of McCarthyism, and it's a period of both political repression, but it was also a period of tremendous gender repression, conformity for women. You know, you were supposed to be in the home, and you were supposed to be a good wife and mother, and it was the period of the greatest repression against homosexuals. So there was also the gendered nature of McCarthyism, so that women who challenged any kind of traditional gender role was branded as neurotic or hysteric and so forth.
Or lesbian.
Or lesbian. And it was hard to determine which was worse, being, you know, a crazy hysteric or a lesbian or both. So it took a while for the language to develop and for the struggle to develop.
Interesting point that you're making, that we didn't have words and that words have helped a lot. I remember back in the 80s going to a lecture on sexual harassment, and the speaker said, you know, we didn't have a word for sexual harassment. What it was life. Mm-hmm. As in, well, that's life. That's the obstacles that you have to somehow circumvent and get through, because that's life. There was no violation seen.
Well, in my case, I was a young...
The word harassment wouldn't even make sense.
I was Antioch, they have work-study jobs, and I had this employer, and he would make passes at me. And he would tell me that if I didn't sleep with him, he would fail me on my work-study project. And if you failed your work-study project, you could, you know, fail the course and grade point average. And there was no kind of recourse. It turned out the employer knew my father, so I told my father, not that he was sexually harassing me, because I don't think my father would have gotten it. I just said I was bored to tears on the job, and so my father complained or something like that. But there wasn't the recourse. I mean, without even the word sexual harassment, you just had to put up with it. You had to find a strategy to deal with it. And it was...
And if you didn't, you were charged as in some way...
Yes.
At fault.
Remember, if you were raped in the 50s and early 60s, you were asking for it. I mean, all the things we now...
Still today in some places.
All the things we really have questioned and changed, just were not questioned in the 50s and 60s.
But thinking back to those early days in Seattle when you were involved in the radical women's movement, and also in England in the late 60s and in 1970, what kinds of things were you engaged in during that time?
Well, I'll tell you about the event that really got our group in the national headlines. During the height of the Vietnam War protests, the University of Washington always had an event called Men's Day and then an event called Women's Day. And in 1968, Men's Day consisted of an antique automobile show, some sort of fraternity events, a folk concert, and then they were bringing a Playboy bunny to the campus. And our group hadn't done anything. We had just met and talked and so forth. So we decided to have a demonstration against the Playboy bunny. And the women who organized it had decided that we were going to put paper bags over our heads and go rush the stage and read from the Book of Common Prayer. And I was a very married young woman. I was very happily married, and I never stepped outside my husband's shadow. And I just thought it seemed so silly, and I wasn't going to do it. The women storm the stage, and then they get beaten up, thrown off the stage, and I'm sitting in the audience.
What was the bunny doing all this time?
She was just, ugh. So I get up, and something pushed me to the stage, and I got up, and I made my first speech about women's liberation, and I said, I was trying to explain that we're tired of being sex objects, and 68 was mini skirts, and my skirt was actually shorter than the Playmates skirt. But I got kicked off the stage, and I realized what I had done. I went to the bathroom and threw up. They then dragged us in front of the dean of students, who announced we were going to be kicked out of school. And of course, we had done nothing.
And your husband was in the school too,
yes,
right?
Of course. He didn't storm the stage or speak or anything, but the guys were totally supportive. And me and this other woman were dragged in front of the dean, and we were introduced as Mrs. Cal Winslow and Mrs. Robbie Stern, and I literally stomped my foot. And I said, I'm not Mrs. Anybody, I'm Barbara Winslow. And then after that, we did a number of demonstrations. We did one in defense of the women of Vietnam, and we dressed in black pajamas